In the 1950s, grandmas made 5-ingredient suppers that mattered. Their clever cooking didn't just fill plates. It turned cheap pantry staples into complete meals for pennies. These 60 forgotten suppers might sound impossible today, but they kept families fed when budgets were tight. Let's rediscover 60 genius suppers grandmas made with just 5 ingredients. Honey glazed ham with fruit became a Sunday supper favorite when Grandma needed something impressive that cost very little and used only 5 ingredients. She placed a small ham in a roasting pan and scored the surface in a diamond pattern with a sharp knife. She mixed brown sugar with honey and spread it thickly over the ham, then arranged canned pineapple rings across the top, securing each with a whole clove pushed through the center. The ham baked at 325 degrees Fahrenheit for about an hour until the glaze caramelized into a shiny, sweet coating. The pineapple turned golden at the edges and released its juice into the pan, creating natural gravy. This supper looked fancy enough for holidays, but cost only pennies per serving because canned pineapple was cheap and a small ham fed the whole family. Grandma served it with the pan juices drizzled over each slice, proving that 5 simple ingredients could create a meal that tasted like celebration, even during tight budget weeks. Creamy tuna bake saved supper when Grandma needed something hot and filling that came together in under 30 minutes using pantry staples. She boiled egg noodles until tender, then drained them and returned them to the pot. She opened 2 cans of tuna and drained the liquid, unflaking the fish with a fork. She stirred a can of cream of mushroom soup and a cup of milk together until smooth, then mixed in the tuna and a cup of frozen peas. Everything combined with the noodles and went into a buttered casserole dish. The casserole baked at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes until bubbling around the edges. This supper stretched 2 small cans of tuna to feed 6 people because the noodles and creamy sauce made it hearty and satisfying. Grandma sometimes topped it with crushed crackers for crunch, but even plain it was comfort food that cost pennies and used ingredients every household kept on hand during the 1950s. Before we move on, many of you asked in the comments where to find these recipes. We even received tons of email too, so we published these recipes on our website. The link is in the description. Let's continue. Open-faced beef dinner turned leftover roast beef into a complete hot supper that felt like Sunday dinner even on a Wednesday night. Grandma sliced leftover roast beef thin and warmed it in a skillet with a little beef gravy from a jar or leftover pan drippings. She placed thick slices of white bread on plates and spooned hot mashed potatoes over each slice, creating a soft base. The warm roast beef went on top of the potatoes, and she ladled hot gravy generously over everything until it soaked into the bread. Each forkful combined tender beef, creamy potatoes, and gravy-soaked bread in one comforting bite. This supper proved that leftovers could become something new and satisfying when assembled cleverly. Grandma made this when the budget was especially tight because it used small amounts of expensive meat stretched across many servings by bread and potatoes that cost almost nothing during the 1950s. Before we continue, canned meat and potato fry became a weeknight staple when Grandma needed supper on the table fast without spending much money. She diced potatoes into small cubes and sliced a can of Spam into thin strips. She heated oil in a large skillet and fried the potatoes first, stirring occasionally until they turned golden and crispy on the edges. She pushed the potatoes to one side and added the Spam slices, letting them brown and develop crispy edges that added wonderful texture. A diced onion went in last, cooking until soft and sweet. Everything mixed together and seasoned with salt and pepper created a hearty one-skillet supper. This meal cost only pennies because Spam was cheap, potatoes were always affordable, and onions grew in every backyard garden. Grandma served it straight from the skillet onto plates, proving that 5 ingredients in one pan could feed a hungry family without fancy techniques or expensive ingredients. Budget salmon cakes stretched 1 can of salmon into enough patties to feed the entire family for pennies per serving. Grandma drained a can of pink salmon and picked through it carefully to remove any bones, then flaked the fish into a bowl with a fork. She added 1 beaten egg, a handful of crushed saltine crackers, and a small diced onion, mixing everything together until it held together when squeezed. She shaped the mixture into flat patties about 3 inches across and ½ an inch thick. The patties fried in hot oil for about 3 minutes per side until golden brown and crispy on the outside while staying moist inside. These salmon cakes tasted rich and satisfying despite using inexpensive canned fish instead of fresh. Grandma served them with a squeeze of lemon or a dollop of tartar sauce if she had it, proving that canned salmon could become a proper supper that everyone actually enjoyed eating. These 5 budget suppers show how 1950s grandmas turned 5 simple ingredients into complete meals that fed families for pennies. From glazed ham to salmon cakes, each recipe proved that clever cooking mattered more than expensive ingredients. Diced ham potato bake used leftover ham scraps and cheap potatoes to create a casserole that tasted rich and satisfying. Grandma sliced potatoes thin and layered them in a buttered casserole dish with diced ham scattered between each layer. She diced an onion and sprinkled it throughout, then poured a can of cream of celery soup mixed with a cup of milk over everything. The casserole went into a 350 degrees Fahrenheit oven covered with foil for 45 minutes until the potatoes were tender. Then she removed the foil and baked another 15 minutes until the top turned golden. This supper stretched a small amount of ham across many servings because the potatoes and creamy sauce made it hearty and filling. Grandma sometimes added a handful of shredded cheese on top during the last few minutes for extra richness, but even without it, this casserole was comfort food that cost almost nothing to make. Pan-fried chops with fruit compote combined savory pork with sweet apples in a simple skillet supper that tasted elegant despite costing pennies. Grandma seasoned pork chops with salt and pepper, and then browned them in a hot skillet with butter until golden on both sides. She pushed the chops to one side and added sliced apples and a spoonful of brown sugar to the pan, stirring until the apples softened and released their juice. A sprinkle of cinnamon added warm spice that made the kitchen smell wonderful. The chops and apples cooked together for another 10 minutes until the pork was tender and the apples became a thick, sweet sauce. This supper felt special because the combination of savory meat and sweet fruit tasted restaurant quality even though it used only 5 ingredients. Grandma served it with the apple compote spooned over each chop, proving that simple ingredients could create impressive meals. SOS on toast earned its nickname from military slang, but became a beloved cheap supper in civilian kitchens across America during the 1950s. Grandma tore dried beef into small pieces and rinsed it under cold water to remove excess salt. She melted butter in a skillet, whisked in flour to make a roux, then gradually added milk while stirring constantly until the mixture thickened into creamy white gravy. The dried beef went into the gravy and heated through for a few minutes. She ladled this generously over toasted white bread on plates, creating a hot, filling supper. This meal stretched a small jar of dried beef to feed 6 people because the cream gravy made it rich and satisfying. Grandma made this when the budget was desperately tight because dried beef kept for months without refrigeration, and the other ingredients were pantry staples every household had. 1 pot, chicken rice. Dinner simplified weeknight cooking by baking chicken and rice together in one dish that required almost no work. Grandma placed chicken pieces in a buttered casserole dish and sprinkled them with salt and pepper. She poured uncooked rice around the chicken, then mixed a can of cream of chicken soup with 2 cups of water and poured it over everything. The dish went into a 350 degrees Fahrenheit oven covered with foil for an hour until the rice absorbed all the liquid and the chicken cooked through. This supper was genius because the chicken released its juices into the rice as it cooked, flavoring everything from the inside out. Grandma sometimes added a diced onion for extra flavor, but even without it, this meal was satisfying and cost only pennies per serving because chicken and rice were among the cheapest proteins and starches available during the 1950s. Skillet beef noodle supper combined ground beef and egg noodles in one pan for a quick, filling meal that children loved. Grandma browned ground beef in a large skillet, breaking it into small crumbles as it cooked. She drained most of the fat, then added diced onion and cooked until soft. A can of tomato soup and a cup of water went in next, stirring until smooth. She added uncooked egg noodles directly to the skillet, pushed them under the sauce, covered the pan with a lid, and simmered for 15 minutes until the noodles were tender. This one-skillet supper meant less cleanup and faster cooking, which busy mothers appreciated. The tomato sauce made it taste like a simplified version of spaghetti that children found less intimidating. Grandma made this at least twice a month because it cost pennies, used pantry staples, and everyone ate it without complaining. These 10 budget suppers prove 1950s grandmas mastered one-pot and skillet cooking that saved time and money. From ham casseroles to beef noodle dinners, each recipe fed families for pennies using 5 ingredients or less. Frank's and baked beans plate became the ultimate quick supper when Grandma had almost no time to cook but needed something hot and filling. She opened a large can of pork and beans and poured it into a saucepan, and then sliced hot dogs into rounds and stirred them in. She added a spoonful of ketchup and a spoonful of mustard for tangy flavor, then heated everything together until bubbling. Some grandmas added a spoonful of brown sugar for sweetness or a diced onion for extra flavor. This supper was ready in under 10 minutes and cost almost nothing because hot dogs and canned beans were among the cheapest proteins available. Grandma served it in bowls with a slice of buttered bread on the side for soaking up the sauce. Children loved this meal because it tasted familiar and comforting, and mothers loved it because it required minimal effort during busy weeks when budgets were tight. Cheese toast supper transformed simple ingredients into a hot, satisfying meal that felt more substantial than it was. Grandma made a simple cheese sauce by melting butter in a saucepan, whisking in flour, then gradually adding milk until smooth and thick. She stirred in shredded sharp cheddar cheese until melted, then added a spoonful of mustard and a pinch of salt. She toasted thick slices of white bread until golden and placed them on plates. The hot cheese sauce got ladled generously over each piece of toast, soaking in and creating a rich, savory supper. This meal was called Welsh rarebit in fancy cookbooks, but grandmas just called it cheese toast and served it when money was especially tight. It cost pennies per serving but tasted rich and filling because the cheese sauce made plain bread feel like a proper meal. Grandma sometimes served it with sliced tomatoes on the side during summer months. Fried lunch meat and Spuds turned bologna and potatoes into a crispy, satisfying skillet supper that children requested by name. Grandma sliced potatoes thin and diced an onion, then fried them together in hot oil until the potatoes turned golden and crispy on the edges. She pushed everything to one side and added thick slices of bologna to the pan, frying them until the edges curled up and browned. The bologna released its smoky, salty flavor into the potatoes as it cooked. Everything mixed together and seasoned with salt and pepper created a one-skillet meal that tasted better than the sum of its parts. This supper cost almost nothing because bologna was cheap lunch meat and potatoes were always affordable. Grandma served it straight from the skillet. I'm proving that humble ingredients cooked properly could become something families looked forward to eating rather than just tolerated during tight budget weeks. Hash and egg skillet used leftover corned beef to create a hearty breakfast for dinner that everyone loved. Grandma diced leftover corned beef into small cubes and chopped cooked potatoes into similar-sized pieces. She diced an onion and fried everything together in butter until the potatoes turned crispy and golden on the edges. She made 4 wells in the hash and cracked an egg into each one, then covered the skillet with a lid and cooked until the egg whites set, but the yolks stayed runny. This supper was genius because the runny yolks acted as built-in sauce when the hash was served. Grandma made this when she had leftover corned beef from a previous dinner, stretching expensive meat across another meal by bulking it up with cheap potatoes. The eggs added protein without much cost, making this a complete, satisfying supper that fed the family for pennies. Italian sausage with vegetables brought bright colors and bold flavors to the 1950s supper table using only 5 ingredients. Grandma sliced Italian sausage links into rounds and browned them in a large skillet until they released their flavorful fat. She sliced bell peppers and onions into strips and added them to the pan, stirring occasionally until they softened and caramelized at the edges. A can of tomato sauce went in last, simmering with everything until the flavors blended together. This one-skillet supper tasted like something from an Italian restaurant, but cost only pennies to make because sausage was relatively cheap and vegetables grew in backyard gardens. Grandma served it over rice or with crusty bread for soaking up the sauce, creating a complete meal that satisfied everyone. The sausage provided plenty of flavor, so no additional seasonings were needed beyond salt and pepper. These 15 budget suppers show how 1950s grandmas created satisfying meals from 5 ingredients. From franks and beans to sausage with vegetables, each recipe proved that simple cooking could feed families well for pennies per serving. Simple Tuna Rice Bowl combined pantry staples into a warm, comforting supper that took almost no effort to prepare. Grandma cooked rice according to package directions, and then stirred in a drained can of tuna and a can of cream of mushroom soup. She added a cup of frozen peas and mixed everything together over low heat until warmed through. A pat of butter stirred in at the end made it rich and creamy. This one-pot supper was ready in 20 minutes and cost only pennies because canned tuna was cheap protein and rice stretched it to feed many people. Grandma made this at least once a week during tight budget periods because it required no fresh ingredients and everything kept in the pantry for months. Children ate it without complaining because the creamy sauce made it familiar and comforting, proving that simple combinations of basic ingredients could create meals families actually enjoyed eating regularly. Cheesy ham pasta used leftover ham scraps to create a creamy, satisfying supper that tasted richer than its simple ingredients suggested. Grandma boiled elbow macaroni until tender, then drained it and returned it to the pot. She diced leftover ham into small cubes and stirred it in along with shredded cheddar cheese, a cup of milk, and a tablespoon of butter. Everything heated together over low heat, stirring constantly until the cheese melted and created a creamy sauce that coated every piece of pasta. This supper stretched a small amount of ham to feed the entire family because the pasta and cheese made it filling and substantial. Grandma made this when she had leftover ham from a previous dinner, proving that scraps and odds and ends could become a completely new meal that everyone loved. It cost almost nothing and took less than 20 minutes from start to finish. Budget beef and vegetable skillet combined ground beef and cabbage in a one-pan supper that cost pennies but satisfied hungry families. Grandma browned ground beef in a large skillet, breaking it into crumbles as it cooked. She added shredded cabbage, diced onion, and a can of diced tomatoes with their juice. Everything simmered together for 15 minutes until the cabbage wilted and became tender. A cup of uncooked rice went in during the last 10 minutes, absorbing the flavorful liquid and bulking up the meal. This supper was genius because cabbage cost almost nothing, especially when grown in backyard gardens, and it stretched expensive ground beef across many servings. The tomatoes added moisture and flavor without needing additional seasonings. Grandma served it in bowls with bread on the side, creating a complete meal that fed 6 people for less than $1 total during 1950s prices. Baked chicken with cream gravy turned inexpensive chicken thighs into a Sunday-worthy supper that looked and tasted impressive. Grandma placed chicken thighs in a baking dish and sprinkled them with dry onion soup mix from a packet. She mixed a can of cream of mushroom soup with a cup of water and poured it over the chicken. The dish went into a 350 degrees Fahrenheit oven for an hour until the chicken cooked through and the gravy thickened around it. She served the chicken over cooked rice with the creamy gravy ladled over everything. This supper tasted like restaurant food, but cost only pennies per serving because chicken thighs were cheap cuts, and the packet of onion soup mix added tons of flavor for almost no money. Grandma made this when she wanted Sunday dinner without spending Sunday prices. Canned meat egg rice bowl combined Spam, eggs, and rice into a filling supper that borrowed flavors from Asian cooking without actually being authentic. Grandma cooked rice and kept it warm. She diced Spam into small cubes and fried them in a hot skillet until crispy on the edges. She pushed the Spam to one side and scrambled eggs in the same pan, then mixed everything together with the cooked rice. A drizzle of soy sauce and a pat of butter added flavor and richness. This supper became popular during the 1950s as soy sauce became more widely available in American grocery stores. It cost almost nothing because Spam was cheap, rice was a budget staple, and eggs were affordable protein. Grandma made this when she wanted something different from the usual meat and potatoes suppers, proving that 5 ingredients could create meals with international flair, even during tight budget weeks. These 20 budget suppers prove 1950s. Grandmas knew how to feed families well using only 5 ingredients. From tuna rice bowls to Spam fried rice, each meal cost pennies per serving, but satisfied everyone at the table without complaint. Braised sausage with tangy cabbage combined smoky sausage with sour cabbage in a German-inspired supper that cost almost nothing to make. Grandma browned sausage links in a large pot until they developed a deep golden crust on all sides, then removed them temporarily. She added a jar of sauerkraut with its juice to the same pot, along with a diced apple and a spoonful of brown sugar to balance the sour flavor. The sausages went back into the pot, nestled into the cabbage mixture. Everything simmered together, covered for 30 minutes until the sausages were cooked through and the cabbage became tender and sweet-sour. The apple broke down into the cabbage, adding natural sweetness that made the dish more complex and interesting. This supper was popular in communities with German heritage, but spread across America during the 1950s because it was cheap, filling, and used ingredients that kept well without refrigeration. Grandma served it with boiled potatoes or rye bread on the side for soaking up the flavorful juice. The entire meal cost pennies per serving because sauerkraut came in large jars that fed many people, sausage was relatively inexpensive, and apples grew in backyard trees during fall months when this dish was most popular. Children sometimes complained about the sour cabbage, but most families ate it without fuss because it was filling and warm. The combination of salty sausage, tangy cabbage, and sweet apple created balanced flavors that made this simple supper taste more sophisticated than its humble ingredients suggested during tight budget weeks. Pan-fried ham and potato dinner turned leftover ham and cheap potatoes into a crispy, satisfying skillet supper that families requested regularly. Grandma diced leftover ham into small cubes and sliced potatoes thin, then diced an onion into small pieces. She heated oil in a large cast-iron skillet and added the potatoes first, cooking them over medium-high heat without stirring too often so they would develop a golden, crispy crust on the bottom. After about 10 minutes, when the potatoes started turning golden, she added the diced onion and ham, stirring everything together and continuing to cook until the potatoes were completely tender inside and crispy outside. She seasoned everything with salt and plenty of black pepper. This one skillet supper was genius because it used small amounts of leftover ham stretched across many servings by bulking it up with cheap potatoes. The crispy texture made it more interesting than plain boiled potatoes, and the ham added smoky, salty flavor throughout. Grandma served it straight from the skillet onto plates, sometimes topping each serving with a fried egg for extra protein and richness without spending much more money. The entire meal came together in under 30 minutes, making it perfect for busy weeknights when mothers needed to get supper on the table fast, without much effort or planning ahead, during the 1950s when time was as precious as money for working families. Fish cakes, budget style, transformed canned tuna into crispy patties that tasted like fancy crab cakes but cost only pennies per serving. Grandma drained 2 cans of tuna and flaked the fish into a bowl with a fork, checking carefully for any bits of bone or skin. She added 1 beaten egg to bind everything together, then stirred in crushed saltine crackers until the mixture was thick enough to hold its shape when formed into patties. A small diced onion went in for flavor and a little crunch. She shaped the mixture into flat patties about 3 inches across and half an inch thick, pressing them firmly so they wouldn't fall apart during cooking. The patties fried in hot oil for about 3 minutes per side until they developed a golden brown, crispy crust while staying moist and tender inside. These fish cakes stretched 2 small cans of tuna to feed 6 people because the crackers and egg bulked up the mixture substantially. Grandma served them hot with a squeeze of lemon juice or a dollop of tartar sauce if she had mayonnaise and pickles to mix together. This supper proved that canned fish could become a respectable meal that everyone actually enjoyed eating without complaining about the budget or the fact that they weren't eating expensive fresh fish from the market during tight weeks in the 1950s. Hamburger Potato Skillet combined ground beef and potatoes in one pan for a hearty, filling supper that required minimal effort and cost. Grandma browned ground beef in a large skillet, breaking it into small crumbles as it cooked, then drained most of the fat. She added diced potatoes and a diced onion directly to the skillet with the beef, stirring everything together. A can of condensed tomato soup mixed with half a can of water went in next, creating a thick sauce that coated everything. She covered the skillet with a lid and simmered over medium-low heat for about 20 minutes until the potatoes were completely tender, stirring occasionally to prevent sticking. In the last 5 minutes, she stirred in a handful of shredded cheddar cheese that melted into the sauce and made it rich and creamy. This one-skillet supper meant less cleanup and faster cooking, which busy mothers with large families appreciated greatly. The combination of meat, potatoes, and cheese made it filling enough that no side dishes were necessary, saving both time and money. Grandma made this at least twice a month because it used only 5 ingredients that every household kept on hand. The entire meal came together in under 40 minutes from start to finish, making it perfect for weeknights when everyone was hungry and dinner needed to be ready fast during the 1950s. Baked chop and rice dinner simplified weeknight cooking by baking pork chops and rice together in one dish that required almost no attention. Grandma placed pork chops in a buttered baking dish and seasoned them with salt and pepper. She scattered uncooked white rice around the chops, then mixed a can of cream of mushroom soup with 2 cups of water and poured it over everything, making sure the rice was completely covered with liquid. A diced onion went in for extra flavor. The dish went into a 350-degree Fahrenheit oven, covered tightly with aluminum foil for an hour until the rice absorbed all the liquid and became tender and the pork chops cooked through completely. This supper was genius because the pork chops released their juices into the rice as everything cooked, flavoring the rice from the inside out without needing additional seasonings or ingredients. Grandma sometimes lifted the foil during the last 10 minutes to let the tops of the chops brown slightly. This meal cost only pennies per serving because pork chops were relatively inexpensive cuts and rice was among the cheapest starches available, stretching the meat to feed the entire family well. The one-dish preparation meant minimal cleanup afterward, which tired mothers appreciated after long days of housework and childcare during busy 1950s family life, when convenience mattered. These 25 budget suppers show how 1950s grandmas turned 5 simple ingredients into complete meals that fed families for pennies. From braised sausage to baked pork chops, each recipe proved that clever cooking mattered more than expensive ingredients or complicated techniques. Frank and Noodle Bake combined hot dogs and egg noodles in a casserole that children loved and mothers appreciated for its low cost. Grandma boiled egg noodles until tender, then drained them and placed them in a buttered casserole dish. She sliced hot dogs into rounds and mixed them into the noodles, along with a can of condensed tomato soup and a diced onion. A handful of shredded cheddar cheese went on top. The casserole baked at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for 25 minutes until bubbling around the edges, and the cheese melted into a golden layer on top. This supper stretched a package of hot dogs to feed 6 people because the noodles bulked it up substantially. The tomato soup created a sauce that kept everything moist and added familiar flavor that children found comforting. Grandma made this when the budget was especially tight because hot dogs were among the cheapest proteins available and the other ingredients were pantry staples. It required minimal preparation and baked while she did other chores, making it perfect for busy weeknights when time and money were both scarce. The combination of noodles, hot dogs, and cheese appealed to children who might refuse more sophisticated dishes, ensuring everyone ate without complaining during the 1950s when mothers needed cooperation at mealtimes to keep households running smoothly on limited budgets. Simple baked white fish turned inexpensive cod or haddock into an elegant supper that tasted restaurant quality despite costing pennies. Grandma placed fish fillets in a buttered baking dish and dotted them with butter. She mixed breadcrumbs with a squeeze of lemon juice and a sprinkle of dried parsley, then pressed this mixture onto the top of each fillet, creating a coating that would turn golden and crispy. The fish baked at 375 degrees Fahrenheit for about 20 minutes until it flaked easily with a fork, and the breadcrumb topping turned golden brown. This supper felt special and light compared to the usual heavy meat and potatoes dinners families ate most nights. Whitefish was relatively inexpensive during the 1950s, especially in coastal areas where it was caught locally. Grandma served it with boiled potatoes and a simple vegetable on the side, creating a complete meal that looked and tasted impressive enough for company, but cost very little to prepare. The lemon juice added brightness that made the fish taste fresher and more refined than its humble price suggested. The breadcrumb coating provided texture and made the fish more interesting than plain baked fillets. This proved that simple preparations could elevate inexpensive ingredients into something special that families enjoyed without needing fancy sauces or complicated techniques during budget-conscious 1950s home cooking. Chicken biscuit casserole transformed leftover chicken into a new supper topped with fluffy biscuits that baked right on top. Grandma diced leftover cooked chicken and placed it in a buttered casserole dish. She mixed a can of cream of chicken soup with a cup of milk and poured it over the chicken, stirring to distribute the sauce evenly. A handful of frozen mixed vegetables went in if she had them. She opened a tube of refrigerated biscuit dough and arranged the biscuits on top of the chicken mixture, covering the surface completely. The casserole baked at 375 degrees Fahrenheit for about 25 minutes until the biscuits turned golden brown on top and the chicken mixture bubbled up around the edges. This supper was genius because it used leftover chicken from a previous dinner, stretching it into a completely new meal that tasted fresh and different. The biscuits soaked up the creamy sauce from underneath, becoming rich and flavorful. Grandma made this when she had leftover chicken that nobody wanted to eat plain again. The combination of creamy chicken filling and fluffy biscuit topping created a complete meal that felt like chicken pot pie without needing to make pastry from scratch. This proved that leftovers could become something everyone looked forward to eating rather than just tolerated during thrifty 1950s cooking when nothing went to waste. Tender beef over noodles turned tough stew meat into a rich, comforting supper that tasted like it had simmered all day. Grandma cut stew beef into small cubes and browned them in a large pot with a little oil. She added a diced onion and let it soften, then poured in a can of cream of mushroom soup mixed with 2 cups of beef broth. The pot simmered, covered on low heat for about 90 minutes, until the beef became fork tender and the sauce thickened into rich gravy. She boiled egg noodles separately according to package directions, then drained them and served them on plates with the beef and gravy ladled generously over the top. This supper felt special because the beef was so tender it practically melted, and the rich gravy made even plain noodles taste luxurious. Grandma made this when stew meat went on sale because even though it was a cheaper cut, the long simmering time made it delicious and satisfying. The entire meal cost only pennies per serving but tasted like Sunday dinner any day of the week. The mushroom gravy was so flavorful that no additional seasonings were needed beyond salt and pepper. This proved that tough. Inexpensive cuts could become tender and delicious with patience and proper cooking methods during budget-conscious 1950s home cooking when time mattered less than money. Canned fish and potato casserole combined canned salmon and sliced potatoes in a creamy bake that stretched expensive fish across many servings. Grandma drained a can of salmon and picked through it carefully to remove bones, then flaked it into chunks. She sliced potatoes thin and layered them in a buttered casserole dish, sprinkling the salmon pieces between the potato layers along with diced onion. She mixed a can of cream of celery soup with a cup of milk and poured it over everything, making sure the liquid reached all the way to the bottom. The casserole baked covered at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for 45 minutes until the potatoes were tender. Then she removed the foil and baked another 15 minutes until the top turned golden. This supper stretched 1 can of salmon to feed 6 people because the potatoes and creamy sauce made it hearty and filling. Grandma made this when canned salmon went on sale. The layers of potatoes, salmon, and onion created interesting texture and flavor in every bite. The cream sauce kept everything moist and bound the ingredients together. This proved that even canned fish could become a respectable supper that everyone enjoyed when prepared properly with simple ingredients. The casserole looked impressive when served, making it suitable for company dinners despite its humble, budget-friendly ingredients during economical 1950s home cooking. These 30 budget suppers prove 1950s grandmas mastered the art of 5-ingredient cooking that saved money without sacrificing flavor. From frank and noodle bakes to salmon casseroles, each recipe fed families well for pennies per serving. Sausage rice. Skillet combined smoky sausage and rice in one pan for a filling supper that required minimal cleanup and cost. Grandma sliced smoked sausage into rounds and browned them in a large skillet until they released their flavorful fat and developed crispy edges. She added diced onion and bell pepper, cooking until soft and sweet. A can of diced tomatoes with their juice went in next, along with uncooked white rice and a cup of water. Everything simmered covered for 20 minutes until the rice absorbed all the liquid and became tender. This one-skillet supper meant less cleanup and fewer dishes to wash, which busy mothers appreciated greatly. The sausage flavored the rice as it cooked, so no additional seasonings were needed beyond salt and pepper. Grandma made this at least once a week because it was fast, cheap, and everyone ate it without complaining. The combination of protein, starch, and vegetables in one pan made it a complete meal that didn't need side dishes, saving both time and money. The colorful bell peppers made it look appealing on the plate, which helped children accept it more readily. This proved that one-pan cooking could produce satisfying, flavorful meals without requiring multiple pots and complicated preparations during busy 1950s weeknights when mothers needed efficient cooking methods. Sweet ham steak. Dinner paired salty ham with sweet potatoes in a simple baked supper that tasted like holiday food any day of the week during 1950s budget cooking when special meals didn't require expensive ingredients. Grandma placed a thick ham steak in a baking dish and arranged peeled sweet potato halves around it, spacing them evenly so they would cook at the same rate. She sprinkled everything with brown sugar generously, covering the surface so it would melt into a glaze during baking and create sweet caramelization on top. She dotted it with butter that would melt into the sugar and create a rich sauce, then added a sprinkle of cinnamon for warm spice that filled the kitchen. The dish baked at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for about 45 minutes until the sweet potatoes were tender when pierced with a fork, and the brown sugar melted into a thick glaze. This supper felt special because the combination of salty ham and sweet potatoes with brown sugar tasted rich and complex despite using only 5 simple ingredients. Ham steaks were relatively inexpensive compared to whole hams, and one steak fed the entire family when paired with filling sweet potatoes that provided substantial carbohydrates. Grandma made this during fall and winter months when sweet potatoes were harvested and cost almost nothing at the grocery store or farm stands nearby. The natural sweetness of the potatoes combined with brown sugar made this dish appealing to children who might otherwise refuse vegetables they didn't like. The cinnamon added warm spice that made the kitchen smell wonderful while it baked, creating an inviting aroma that drew everyone to the table eagerly. This proved that smart flavor combinations could make budget ingredients taste like celebration food, worthy of holidays and special occasions rather than just weeknight dinners. The entire meal baked in one dish, without needing multiple pots or pans, requiring minimal cleanup afterward when mothers were already tired from long days. The sweet and savory combination created balanced flavors that satisfied everyone at the table during economical 1950s family suppers when variety and taste helped prevent. The ham provided salty and smoky protein, while the sweet potatoes offered natural sweetness and filling starch that kept everyone satisfied for hours without needing expensive second helpings or additional side dishes that would cost more money to prepare and serve at dinner each night throughout the busy week. Ground meat and spud skillet turned beef and potatoes into a one-pan supper that satisfied hungry families without much work or cost during 1950s budget cooking when efficiency mattered as much as economy. Grandma browned ground beef in a large skillet over medium-high heat, breaking it into crumbles as it cooked, then drained most of the fat to keep the dish lighter. She added diced potatoes cut into small half-inch cubes and diced onion directly to the skillet with the beef, then stirring everything together so flavors would blend as they cooked. A can of condensed tomato soup mixed with half a can of water created a thick sauce that coated everything and added familiar tomato flavor children loved. The skillet simmered, covered for about 20 minutes, until the potatoes were completely tender when tested with a fork, with occasional stirring to prevent sticking on the bottom. This supper was genius because everything cooked in one pan, saving time on both preparation and cleanup afterward when mothers were already exhausted from long days. The tomato soup added familiar flavor that children loved, while also providing moisture that kept the potatoes from drying out during the cooking process. Grandma made this multiple times each month because it required only 5 ingredients that every household kept on hand in the pantry, and it could be prepared quickly. The combination of meat and potatoes was filling enough that no side dishes were necessary, making it a complete meal from one skillet without needing additional vegetables. This proved that simple ingredients combined properly could create satisfying suppers that fed families well without requiring expensive cuts of meat or fancy preparations during budget-conscious cooking. The entire meal came together in under 40 minutes from start to finish, making it perfect for busy weeknights when time was limited and everyone was hungry. The tomato sauce made the dish moist and flavorful, preventing it from being dry or boring like some one-pot meals could become when cooked improperly. Children ate this without complaining because the flavors were familiar and comforting, not strange or challenging like some dishes that required acquired tastes. The leftovers reheated well the next day for lunch, making it a practical meal that stretched across multiple eating occasions throughout the week when every bit of food needed to count toward feeding the family adequately on limited budgets. Cold tuna macaroni plate became a summer supper favorite when Grandma didn't want to heat up the kitchen but needed something filling during 1950s budget cooking when seasonal meal planning mattered. She boiled elbow macaroni in salted water until tender and fully cooked, then drained it thoroughly and rinsed it under cold water to cool it completely and stop the cooking. She added drained canned tuna that had been flaked with a fork, diced celery for crunch and freshness, diced onion for sharpness and bite, and enough mayonnaise to coat everything. She stirred in salt and pepper to taste, mixing everything together until well combined, and the mayonnaise coated every piece of pasta and tuna evenly. This cold supper was served on plates with sliced tomatoes or lettuce on the side if available from the garden, creating a complete cold meal. Families ate it during hot summer months when turning on the oven was unbearable and everyone wanted something cool and refreshing rather than hot food. The combination of protein from tuna, starch from macaroni, and vegetables from celery and onion made it a complete meal that didn't need heating or cooking. Grandma made extra so leftovers could be eaten for lunch the next day, stretching 2 cans of tuna across multiple meals throughout the week efficiently. This supper cost only pennies per serving and proved that not every meal needed to be hot to be satisfying and filling for hungry families. The celery added pleasant crunch that contrasted nicely with the soft pasta and flaked tuna, creating textural variety that made the dish more interesting to eat. This demonstrated that cold suppers could be just as filling and nutritious as hot meals during warm weather months when families needed relief from kitchen heat. The mayonnaise added richness and held everything together, creating a cohesive salad that didn't fall apart when served on plates at the dinner table. The onion provided sharpness that balanced the rich mayonnaise and mild tuna, preventing the dish from being too bland or boring to eat regularly. This proved that summer cooking could be simple and efficient, requiring no heat, but still providing complete nutrition and satisfaction for families eating together during economical 1950s. Summers, when keeping the kitchen cool, mattered as much as keeping the food budget low throughout the season. Pan-fried organ meat. Supper used chicken livers, an extremely cheap protein, to create a rich, savory supper that cost almost nothing during 1950s, budget cooking when resourceful cooks used every available protein. Grandma rinsed chicken livers under cold water and patted them dry with paper towels, then dredged them in seasoned flour mixed with salt and pepper for coating. She fried bacon in a skillet until crispy and browned, removed it to drain on paper towels, then used the bacon fat to fry the livers without wasting any fat. The livers fried for about 3 minutes per side until browned outside, but still slightly pink inside, maintaining their tender texture without becoming tough or rubbery. She cooked sliced onions in the same pan until caramelized and sweet, scraping up the browned bits from the bottom that added deep flavor to everything. The livers, crumbled bacon, and onions served together created a supper that was rich in iron and protein but cost only pennies per serving for the family. And Grandma served this with mashed potatoes or rice to soak up the flavorful pan juices that remained after cooking, ensuring nothing was wasted from the dish. Chicken livers were among the cheapest proteins available during the 1950s because most people didn't want to eat them, which meant families on tight budgets could buy them. This supper proved that even the most humble ingredients could become delicious when cooked properly with simple techniques and a few complementary flavors like bacon and onions. The bacon added smoky richness that balanced the mineral flavor of the livers, making them more appealing to people who might otherwise refuse organ meats. The caramelized onions provided sweetness that rounded out the savory dish perfectly during economical 1950s cooking, when resourceful cooks used every available protein source to feed families. The pan drippings created a sauce that made mashed potatoes or rice taste incredible, proving that nothing should be wasted when cooking on a tight budget. This meal demonstrated the resourcefulness of Depression-era and 1950s cooks who knew how to make inexpensive, overlooked ingredients taste good through proper preparation and complementary pairings with bacon and sweet caramelized onions that enhanced rather than masked the natural flavors of the affordable organ meat that many families relied on for protein when budgets were extremely tight. These 35 budget suppers show how 1950s grandmas created satisfying meals using only 5 ingredients. From sausage rice skillets to organ meat dinners, each recipe proved that affordable cooking could still taste good and feed families well. Breakfast, sausage with apples combined morning sausage links with sweet fruit in a breakfast for dinner that everyone loved. Grandma browned breakfast sausage links in a large skillet until cooked through and golden on all sides, then removed them temporarily. She sliced apples and added them to the same skillet with the sausage drippings, sprinkling them with brown sugar. The apples cooked until soft and caramelized, creating a thick, sweet sauce. The sausages went back into the pan to heat through. This supper worked for dinner, even though it used breakfast meat, because the sweet apples made it feel special and different. Grandma served it with rice or mashed potatoes on the side to soak up the sweet apple sauce. This meal cost very little because breakfast sausage was cheap and apples grew in backyard trees, or could be bought inexpensively during fall harvest season. The combination of savory meat and sweet fruit appealed to both adults and children, making it a supper that everyone ate without complaining. The brown sugar caramelized with the apple juices to create a glossy sauce that looked appetizing. This proved that mixing sweet and savory flavors could transform simple ingredients into interesting meals that felt special despite tight budgets during creative 1950s, home cooking when variety mattered. Canned meat fried rice borrowed Asian flavors to turn leftover rice and Spam into an exciting supper that felt exotic during 1950s budget cooking when international cuisines began appearing in American households. Grandma cooked rice and let it cool completely, then diced Spam into small cubes about a quarter-inch on each side so they would brown evenly in the hot pan. She heated oil in a large skillet or wok, if she had one, and fried the Spam until crispy on the edges, developing a golden crust that added texture. She pushed it to one side and scrambled eggs in the same pan, breaking them into small pieces that would distribute throughout the rice when mixed together. The cold rice went in next, stirring and breaking up clumps until everything was mixed together and the rice was heated through completely without any cold spots. A drizzle of soy sauce added salty, savory flavor that transformed the simple ingredients into something that tasted international and different from usual American suppers. Frozen peas stirred in at the end added color, sweetness, and a vegetable component that made the dish more complete and nutritious for families. This supper became popular during the 1950s as American families became more curious about international flavors, and soy sauce became widely available in grocery stores nationwide. It cost almost nothing because it used leftover rice from a previous meal, cheap Spam that every household kept in the pantry, and just a few other ingredients. Grandma made this when she wanted something different from the usual meat and potatoes suppers that dominated weeknight tables and bored children who wanted variety in their meals. The fried rice technique made leftovers feel new and exciting, rather than boring, reheated food that children might refuse during economical 1950s cooking when creativity helped stretch budgets. The combination of crispy Spam, fluffy rice, scrambled eggs, and sweet peas created textural variety that made every bite interesting and kept people eating until their plates were clean. The soy sauce added umami flavor that Americans were just beginning to understand and appreciate as international foods became more accessible after World War II. This proved that leftovers could be transformed into completely new dishes that tasted fresh and different, rather than just reheated versions of previous meals that nobody wanted. The entire supper came together in under 20 minutes from start to finish, making it perfect for busy weeknights when time was limited and everyone was hungry immediately. Boiled beef and cabbage plate turned inexpensive corned beef and cheap cabbage into a traditional Irish-American supper that filled everyone up during 1950s budget cooking when one-pot meals simplified dinner preparation. Grandma placed a corned beef brisket in a large pot and covered it with water, then brought it to a boil and simmered covered for about 2 hours until the meat was fork tender. She added quartered cabbage and chunks of potatoes to the same pot during the last 30 minutes of cooking, letting them cook in the flavorful broth that the beef had created. A diced onion went in, too, for extra flavor and sweetness that balanced the salty beef and mild cabbage perfectly in the finished dish. When everything was tender, she removed the meat carefully and sliced it thin against the grain to keep it from being tough, then served it on plates with cabbage and potatoes. The cooking liquid could be served as broth on the side or used to moisten the meat, adding extra flavor to every bite on the dinner plate. This one-pot supper was popular in communities with Irish heritage, but spread across America because it was extremely cheap and filling for large families with growing children. Corned beef was inexpensive compared to other cuts of meat, cabbage cost almost nothing at the grocery store, and potatoes were always affordable year-round in every region. The long simmering time made even tough cuts of meat tender and flavorful, demonstrating how patience in cooking could transform inexpensive ingredients into something delicious and satisfying. This proved that patience and simple cooking methods could transform humble ingredients into satisfying meals that fed large families well during economical 1950s home cooking when one-pot meals. The entire meal required minimal preparation, just cutting vegetables and letting everything simmer unattended for hours, while Grandma did other household chores and tasks throughout the busy afternoon. Children ate this without complaining because the flavors were mild and familiar, not challenging or strange like some ethnic foods that were becoming popular during this era. The leftovers made excellent sandwiches the next day, with thin slices of corned beef on rye bread becoming a lunch favorite that extended the meal even further. The broth could be saved and used as soup base for another meal later in the week, ensuring nothing was wasted from this economical supper that fed families well. Hot pork sandwich platter used leftover roast pork to create an open-faced supper that felt like Sunday dinner on a weeknight during 1950s budget cooking when repurposing leftovers prevented waste. Grandma sliced leftover pork roast thin against the grain and warmed it in a skillet with a little pork gravy or canned gravy, heating it gently without drying out the meat. She placed thick slices of white bread on plates and topped them with the hot pork slices, arranging them to cover the bread completely, from edge to edge. She made quick coleslaw by shredding cabbage and mixing it with mayonnaise, vinegar, and a pinch of sugar, creating a tangy, creamy topping that balanced the rich pork. The coleslaw went on top of the pork in a generous mound, and more hot gravy got drizzled over everything until it soaked into the bread below. This supper turned small amounts of leftover pork into a complete meal by bulking it up with bread and coleslaw that cost almost nothing to prepare fresh. The combination of hot meat, cool, crunchy slaw, and gravy-soaked bread created interesting contrasts in temperature and texture that made every bite different and exciting to eat. Grandma made this when she had leftover pork from a previous dinner, proving that leftovers could be transformed into something new that everyone enjoyed rather than just reheated. The coleslaw added freshness and crunch that balanced the rich meat and gravy, preventing the dish from feeling too heavy or monotonous on the plate. This demonstrated that creative assembly could make leftovers feel like brand-new meals rather than boring repeats, helping stretch food budgets further during thrifty 1950s cooking when nothing went to waste. The open-faced format made it feel more substantial and special than a regular sandwich, elevating humble leftovers into something that looked impressive on the dinner table. The entire meal came together in under 15 minutes from start to finish, making it perfect for busy weeknights when time was limited and everyone needed to eat quickly. Children ate this without complaining because the flavors were familiar and the coleslaw added a fun, crunchy element that made the meal more interesting than plain reheated pork. This proved that with a little creativity, yesterday's leftovers could become today's satisfying supper that everyone looked forward to eating rather than viewing as boring seconds nobody wanted to finish eating completely. Chicken drop, dumpling stew combined chicken and fluffy dumplings in a one-pot supper that felt like comfort in a bowl during 1950s budget cooking when warming meals brought families together. Grandma cut chicken into pieces and simmered it in broth until tender and cooked through completely, then removed the bones carefully and discarded them without wasting any meat. She added a can of cream of chicken soup to thicken the broth into rich gravy that would coat the dumplings and chicken pieces when everything was served. She mixed biscuit baking mix with milk to make dumpling batter that was thick enough to hold its shape, but not too stiff or dry to work with. She dropped spoonfuls of batter directly onto the simmering chicken mixture, spacing them so they wouldn't stick together as they expanded during cooking in the hot liquid. The pot covered with a tight-fitting lid for 15 minutes without peaking, allowing the dumplings to steam and puff up properly into fluffy, tender pillows floating on top. When the lid came off after the full 15 minutes, the dumplings were fluffy and cooked through, floating on top of the creamy chicken stew beautifully. This supper was ultimate comfort food that tasted like Grandma had worked all day, even though it came together in under an hour from start to finish. The dumplings stretched the chicken to feed many people, and everything cooked in one pot for easy cleanup afterward when mothers were already tired from long days. Grandma made this during cold weather when families needed warming, filling suppers that didn't cost much but satisfied everyone completely without needing expensive ingredients or complicated techniques. The fluffy dumplings soaked up the creamy chicken gravy, making every bite satisfying and rich with flavor that made people want second helpings if there was enough. This proved that simple techniques like drop dumplings could transform basic ingredients into restaurant-quality comfort food that satisfied everyone at the table during economical 1950s home cooking. The one-pot preparation meant less time at the sink washing dishes afterward, which exhausted mothers appreciated greatly after preparing meals all day long. Children loved the fluffy dumplings and tender chicken in creamy gravy, eating it eagerly without complaints or protests that often accompanied other meals during the busy week when cooperation mattered greatly. Rehook. These 40 budget suppers prove 1950s. Grandmas were masters at creating satisfying meals from just 5 ingredients. From breakfast sausage with apples to chicken and dumplings, each recipe fed families well for pennies while keeping everyone happy at the table. Quick beef in sour cream transformed ground beef into a rich, creamy supper that tasted like fancy beef, stroganoff, but cost only pennies per serving during tight budget weeks in the 1950s, when resourceful cooking mattered most to families struggling financially. Grandma browned ground beef in a large skillet over medium-high heat, breaking it into small crumbles as it cooked, then drained most of the fat to keep the dish from being too greasy and heavy on the stomach. She added a diced onion to the same skillet and cooked it until soft and translucent, releasing its natural sweetness into the meat and creating an aromatic base for the sauce that would coat everything. A can of cream of mushroom soup went in next, stirred until it coated all the beef and onion evenly, and created a thick, creamy sauce with mushroom flavor throughout. She added about half a cup of sour cream, stirring constantly over low heat so it wouldn't curdle or separate from the heat and ruin the smooth texture everyone loved at dinner. The mixture simmered gently for about 5 minutes until everything was heated through completely, and the flavors blended together beautifully into a cohesive dish that smelled wonderful. Meanwhile, she boiled egg noodles in a separate pot, according to package directions, until they were tender but not mushy, maintaining a slight bite that provided good texture. She drained the noodles thoroughly and served them on plates with the creamy beef mixture ladled generously over the top, coating every strand with rich sauce. This supper tasted rich and indulgent despite using inexpensive ground beef instead of the expensive steak strips that traditional stroganoff required in fancy restaurant versions that cost far more. This supper tasted rich and indulgent despite using inexpensive ground beef instead of the expensive steak strips that traditional stroganoff required in fancy restaurant versions that cost far more. The sour cream added tangy richness that made the dish taste more sophisticated than its humble ingredients suggested to anyone eating it at the family table. Grandma made this when she wanted something that felt special, but couldn't afford expensive cuts of meat from the butcher shop downtown, where prices were high. The cream of mushroom soup provided body and mushroom flavor without needing to buy fresh mushrooms, which were expensive during the 1950s and not always available in stores. The entire meal came together in under 30 minutes from start to finish. I'm making it perfect for busy weeknights when time was limited and everyone was hungry after work. Children loved the creamy sauce and didn't complain about eating it, which was always important when feeding large families on tight budgets, where cooperation and acceptance mattered greatly. The leftovers reheated well the next day for lunch, sometimes even tasting better after the flavors had more time to meld together overnight in the refrigerator while stored properly. Tuna green pea noodles combined canned tuna with egg noodles and sweet peas in a creamy one-pot supper that cost almost nothing but satisfied hungry families completely during economical 1950s, cooking when every penny counted toward household budgets. Grandma boiled egg noodles in salted water until they were tender and cooked through properly, and then drained them thoroughly and returned them to the pot to keep warm while preparing other ingredients. She opened 2 cans of tuna and drained the liquid completely, then flaked the fish with a fork into small pieces, checking carefully for any bones that might have been missed. A can of cream of mushroom soup went into the pot with the noodles, along with about a cup of milk, stirring everything together over low heat until it was smooth, creamy, and well combined throughout the entire mixture. She added a cup of frozen peas and the flaked tuna, mixing gently so the tuna wouldn't break apart into mush and lose its texture completely, keeping nice chunks. Everything heated together for about 5 minutes until the peas were tender and bright green, and the tuna was warmed through to proper serving temperature without overcooking. A pat of butter stirred in at the end added richness and made the sauce silkier and more luxurious on the tongue, coating everything beautifully with glossy finish. This supper stretched 2 small cans of tuna to feed 6 people because the noodles, peas, and creamy sauce bulked it up substantially and made it filling enough for dinner. The green peas added color that made the dish look more appealing and appetizing on the plate, which helped children accept it more readily without complaining about eating fish. The cream of mushroom soup provided the base for the sauce without needing to make a roux from scratch with flour and butter, saving time and effort on busy weeknights. Grandma made this at least once a week during tight budget periods because canned tuna was one of the cheapest proteins available at grocery stores, and all the other ingredients were staples. The entire meal could be prepared in one pot from start to finish, which meant less cleanup afterward when mothers were already exhausted from long days of housework and childcare. This proved that simple pantry ingredients combined properly could create satisfying, nutritious meals that everyone actually enjoyed eating without complaints or protests at the table. The combination of protein from tuna, starch from noodles, and vegetables from peas made it a complete, balanced meal without needing expensive fresh ingredients or complicated preparations during economical cooking periods. Slow-baked ham and legumes Slow-baked ham and legumes turned a small ham hock and dried beans into a hearty, filling supper that cost pennies, but fed many people during Depression-era and 1950s thrift cooking when stretching ingredients mattered enormously to family survival. Grandma soaked dried navy beans or pinto beans overnight in cold water to soften them and reduce cooking time the next day, making them more tender and easier to digest. She drained the soaked beans completely and placed them in a large Dutch oven or heavy pot with a ham hock, a diced onion, and enough water to cover everything by 2 inches. A few spoonfuls of brown sugar and a squirt of ketchup went in for sweetness and tang that balanced the smoky ham perfectly and added depth of flavor. The pot went into a 300-degree Fahrenheit oven covered with a tight-fitting lid for about 3 hours, checking occasionally to make sure the beans didn't dry out and adding more water if needed. The long, slow cooking made the beans incredibly tender and creamy, while the ham hock released its smoky, salty flavor into the beans throughout the entire cooking process slowly. When it was done, Grandma removed the ham hock carefully and cut off any meat still clinging to the bone, then stirred it back into the beans generously. This supper was genius because one inexpensive ham hock flavored an entire pot of cheap dried beans, stretching it to feed a large family for almost no money. The beans provided protein and fiber that kept everyone full for hours without needing expensive meat, and the ham added just enough meat flavor to make it satisfying. Grandma served this with cornbread on the side for soaking up the flavorful bean liquid, creating a complete Southern-style meal that cost less than $1 total to make. The leftovers were even better the next day, after the flavors had more time to blend together overnight in the refrigerator, intensifying and deepening with time in storage. This proved that patience and slow cooking could transform the most humble, inexpensive ingredients into deeply satisfying meals that nourished families well during tight-budget weeks in the 50s. Resourceful home cooks knew every trick for making cheap ingredients taste good and stretch far to feed everyone adequately without complaints or going hungry at any meal throughout the week when money was tight. Gravy over bread turned breakfast sausage and milk into a thick, peppery gravy served over toast for a filling supper that cost almost nothing during the 1950s, when budget meals needed to be substantial and satisfying. Grandma browned breakfast sausage in a large skillet over medium heat, breaking it into small crumbles as it cooked until no pink remained and it was fully cooked through completely. Instead of draining the fat like she might for other dishes, she left it in the pan because it would become the flavorful base for the gravy that everyone loved at the table. She sprinkled flour directly over the cooked sausage and fat, stirring constantly for about a minute to cook out the raw flour taste and create a proper roux for thickening. Then she slowly poured in milk while whisking vigorously to prevent lumps from forming in the gravy and ruining the smooth texture everyone expected from good cooking. The mixture bubbled and thickened within a few minutes into a rich, creamy gravy studded with bits of sausage throughout every spoonful that was ladled onto plates. She seasoned it generously with black pepper and a little salt, though the sausage was already salty, so not much additional salt was needed for proper balanced flavor. The gravy simmered for a few more minutes to develop flavor and reach the perfect thick consistency that would coat the back of a spoon properly when tested. She toasted thick slices of white bread and placed them on plates, then ladled the hot sausage gravy generously over each piece until it was completely covered and soaking deeply. This supper was called biscuits and gravy in restaurants and diners, but grandmas often served it over toast at home because toast was faster and easier than making biscuits from scratch. The entire meal came together in under 15 minutes from start to finish, making it perfect for nights when everyone was hungry and supper needed to be ready immediately. The sausage provided protein, the milk added calcium, and the bread gave carbohydrates for energy, making it a surprisingly complete meal despite its simplicity and limited number of ingredients. This proved that with just 5 ingredients, sausage, flour, milk, bread, and black pepper, grandmas could create filling, satisfying suppers that fed families well when budget meals needed to be both quick and substantial every night. Breaded chops with pan gravy turned inexpensive pork chops into a crispy, satisfying supper, topped with rich homemade gravy that tasted restaurant quality, despite costing pennies during the 1950s when budget cooking mattered greatly to families. Grandma pounded pork chops thin with a meat mallet to tenderize them and help them cook faster and more evenly without drying out or becoming tough and chewy. She set up a simple breading station with seasoned flour in a shallow dish, mixing in salt and pepper, coating each chop thoroughly on both sides with the flour mixture. She heated oil in a large skillet over medium-high heat and fried the breaded chops for about 4 minutes per side until they were golden brown and crispy on the outside. She removed the chops to a plate and kept them warm while she made the gravy in the same pan using the flavorful drippings left behind from frying. She poured off most of the oil, but left about 2 tablespoons along with all the browned bits stuck to the bottom that contained concentrated flavor from the meat. She sprinkled flour into the hot oil and stirred constantly to make a roux, scraping up the browned bits from the bottom of the pan with the spoon. She then slowly added milk while whisking continuously to create smooth gravy without lumps forming anywhere in the mixture, stirring vigorously to incorporate everything evenly throughout. The gravy bubbled and thickened within a few minutes, and Grandma scraped up all the flavorful browned bits from the bottom of the pan to incorporate into the sauce. She seasoned the gravy with salt and plenty of black pepper for warmth and depth, then poured it over the pork chops on the serving plates generously and abundantly. This supper felt special because the crispy breaded coating and rich gravy made simple pork chops taste like something from a restaurant instead of plain home cooking on a weeknight. Grandma served this with mashed potatoes and a vegetable on the side, creating a complete meat and potatoes meal that satisfied everyone at the table without any complaints from children. Pork chops were relatively inexpensive cuts that most families could afford even during tight budget weeks when money was scarce and groceries cost precious dollars that were hard to come by. The breading stretched the meal further by adding bulk and making the chops feel more substantial on the plate than plain meat alone would have been at dinner. These 45 budget suppers show how 1950s grandmas created complete meals using only 5 ingredients. From beef stroganoff to breaded pork chops, each recipe proved that simple cooking techniques and inexpensive ingredients could feed families well for pennies when budgets were tight and resourcefulness mattered most. Beef and grain skillet combined ground beef with rice in a one-pan supper that required minimal effort and cost almost nothing during 1950s budget cooking when efficiency and thrift were essential to household management. Grandma browned ground beef in a large skillet over medium-high heat, breaking it into small crumbles as it cooked. Ma then drained most of the fat to keep the meal lighter and healthier. She added a diced onion and cooked it until soft and translucent, releasing its natural sweetness into the beef and creating a flavorful aromatic base for the entire dish. A can of condensed tomato soup went in next, along with a can of water, stirring until smooth and well combined throughout the skillet without any lumps remaining. She added uncooked white rice directly to the skillet, pushing it under the liquid to make sure it was covered completely so it would cook properly and absorb all the flavors. A handful of shredded cheddar cheese went in during the last few minutes, stirring until it melted into the sauce and made it rich and creamy with a golden color. The skillet simmered covered for about 20 minutes until the rice absorbed all the liquid and became tender and fluffy, with the grains separate and perfectly cooked. This one-pan supper meant less cleanup and faster cooking, which busy mothers with large families appreciated tremendously when managing hectic households and schedules every single day. The rice stretched the ground beef to feed many more people than meat alone would have, making it economical and filling for large families with growing children. The tomato soup provided familiar flavor that children loved and also added moisture to cook the rice properly without needing additional broth or stock from scratch. Grandma made this multiple times each month because it used only 5 ingredients that every household kept on hand, and it could be prepared quickly on weeknights. The cheese made it feel more indulgent and special despite its simplicity and low cost, adding richness and depth that elevated the humble ingredients into something more. Frank and Spud pan fry turned hot dogs and potatoes into a crispy, golden skillet supper that children loved and mothers appreciated for its low cost during 1950s, budget weeks when every penny mattered. Grandma diced potatoes into small cubes about half an inch on each side so they would cook quickly and develop crispy edges that everyone loved at the dinner table. She sliced hot dogs into rounds about a quarter-inch thick so they would brown evenly and distribute throughout the dish, ensuring every bite had some meat in it. She diced an onion into small pieces that would soften and caramelize, adding sweetness and depth to the savory dish that made it more complex and interesting. She heated oil in a large cast-iron skillet over medium-high heat until it shimmered, then added the potatoes in a single layer without stirring too often so they would develop golden crust. After about 10 minutes, when the potatoes started turning crispy and golden brown on the bottom, she added the onion and hot dog slices, stirring everything together and continuing to cook. She cooked until the potatoes were completely tender inside and crispy outside, and the hot dogs were browned and slightly caramelized, developing deeper flavor from the high heat. She seasoned everything with salt and black pepper generously to taste, and some grandmas added a squirt of ketchup at the end for sweetness and tang. This one skillet supper was genius because it used inexpensive ingredients that everyone had on hand, and it came together quickly without much effort or complicated techniques. The crispy potatoes were the star of the dish, and providing satisfying texture and bulk that filled everyone up without costing much money at all during tight weeks. The hot dogs added protein and their salty, smoky flavor throughout the dish, making it more substantial and satisfying than just potatoes alone would have been. The onions provided sweetness and depth that balanced the saltiness of the hot dogs perfectly, creating a well-rounded flavor profile that appealed to everyone at the table. Molded salmon dinner transformed canned salmon into an impressive baked loaf that sliced beautifully and tasted much fancier than its humble ingredients suggested during 1950s budget entertaining, when presentation mattered as much as taste. Grandma drained 2 cans of salmon and picked through the fish carefully to remove any bones or bits of skin, then flaked it into a mixing bowl with a fork. She added crushed saltine crackers to act as a binder and provide structure, along with a beaten egg to hold everything together and create a firm texture when baked. A small diced onion went in for flavor, and a splash of milk to keep it moist and tender inside, preventing it from drying out during the baking process. She mixed everything together gently so the salmon wouldn't break apart into mush, then pressed the mixture firmly into a greased loaf pan, packing it down carefully. The loaf baked at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for about 45 minutes until it was set and lightly golden on top, developing a slightly firm exterior while staying moist inside. She let it rest for 5 minutes after removing it from the oven, then carefully inverted it onto a serving platter so it would release cleanly and maintain its shape. The salmon loaf sliced beautifully into thick pieces that held together perfectly on the plate without falling apart. Looking restaurant quality and impressive to guests who visited, Grandma served it with a simple white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk poured over each slice, or sometimes with lemon wedges for squeezing and brightness. This supper looked impressive enough to serve to company, despite costing very little to make with just 5 basic ingredients that every household kept stocked. The loaf format made canned salmon feel more substantial and elegant than just serving it plain or in patties, elevating the humble ingredient into something special. 2 cans of salmon stretched to feed 6 people when formed into a loaf and bulked up with crackers and egg, making it extremely economical. The egg and crackers provided structure while the milk kept it moist and tender inside, creating a pleasant texture that everyone enjoyed eating without complaints. This proved that with proper presentation and simple techniques, even canned fish. Breakfast meat and egg bake combined sausage, eggs, and bread in a savory casserole that worked perfectly for supper, despite being made with breakfast ingredients during versatile 1950s cooking when meals crossed traditional boundaries. Grandma browned breakfast sausage in a skillet, breaking it into crumbles, then drained the fat completely to keep the casserole from being too greasy when it baked in the oven. She cubed white bread and placed it in a buttered casserole dish, then scattered the cooked sausage over the bread cubes evenly so every serving would have meat. She beat eggs with milk and a little salt and pepper, and then poured this mixture over the bread and sausage, making sure everything was soaked completely with the egg custard. A handful of shredded cheddar cheese went on top, covering the surface and adding richness and color when it melted and browned during baking in the hot oven. The casserole sat for about 10 minutes, so the bread could absorb the egg mixture completely, becoming saturated and ready to bake into a cohesive dish. Then it baked at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for about 35 minutes until the eggs were set, and the top was golden and slightly puffed, creating an appealing presentation on the table. This supper felt hearty and satisfying because the combination of bread, eggs, sausage, and cheese provided protein, carbohydrates, and calcium all in one dish without needing multiple sides. And Grandma made this when she wanted something different from the usual dinner foods, and breakfast for dinner was always popular with children who found it fun and unexpected during weeknight meals. The casserole could be assembled ahead of time and refrigerated, then baked when needed, making it perfect for busy days when advanced preparation helped manage time efficiently. It used inexpensive ingredients that every household kept on hand: eggs, bread, sausage, milk, and cheese, making it economical and accessible for tight budgets throughout the year. The bread soaked up the egg custard and became soft and rich inside, while developing a slightly crispy top that added textural contrast to every bite. This proved that breakfast foods could make satisfying suppers when prepared in casserole form rather than just fried in a pan on the stovetop quickly. Beefy. Elbow macaroni combined ground beef and pasta in a simple one-pot supper that tasted like a simplified version of spaghetti that children found less intimidating during picky 1950s family mealtimes when cooperation mattered. Grandma browned ground beef in a large pot, breaking it into fine crumbles as it cooked. She added a diced onion and cooked it until soft and sweet, and releasing its natural sugars and creating a flavorful base for the tomato sauce that would coat everything. A large can of tomato soup went in next, along with a can of water, stirring until smooth and well combined without any lumps remaining in the mixture. She added uncooked elbow macaroni directly to the pot. The pot cooked covered for about 15 minutes until the macaroni was tender and had absorbed most of the liquid. In the last few minutes, she stirred in a handful of shredded cheddar cheese that melted into the sauce and made it creamy and rich with golden color. This one-pot supper meant minimal cleanup and faster cooking. The elbow macaroni was less messy than spaghetti and easier for children to eat, The cheese made it taste indulgent, despite being extremely economical, adding richness and depth. The entire meal came together in one pot in under 30 minutes from start to finish, providing complete nutrition with protein from beef, carbohydrates from pasta, and dairy from cheese. This proved that ground beef and pasta were a perfect combination. These 50 budget suppers prove 1950s. Grandmas knew every trick for feeding families well, using only 5 ingredients. From beef and rice to salmon loaves, each recipe demonstrated that resourceful cooking could create satisfying meals for pennies when money was tight and creativity was essential. Budget fish and potato fry turned inexpensive white fish fillets and potatoes into a crispy, golden supper that tasted like British fish and chips during 1950s, American home cooking when international flavors began appearing. Grandma cut fish fillets into smaller pieces about 3 inches long, then dredged them in seasoned flour mixed with salt and pepper for proper coating and flavor. She sliced potatoes into thick sticks or wedges that would hold together during frying without falling apart or becoming mushy when cooked through completely. She heated a good amount of oil in a large skillet or deep pan until it was hot enough that a piece of potato sizzled immediately when dropped in. She fried the potato pieces first, working in batches so they wouldn't steam and become soggy, cooking them for about 8 minutes until they were golden and crispy outside. She removed them to drain on paper towels and sprinkled them with salt while they were still hot, letting the seasoning stick to the surface properly. Then she fried the floured fish pieces for about 3 minutes per side until they were golden brown and crispy outside and flaky inside, developing a crunchy coating. The fish and potatoes served together created a complete meal that tasted special and different from the usual supper fare families ate most nights during the week. Grandma served it with vinegar for sprinkling over everything or with lemon wedges for squeezing over the fish, adding brightness and acidity that cut through the richness. Sometimes she made a quick tartar sauce by mixing mayonnaise with pickle relish, creating a condiment that everyone loved dipping the fish and potatoes into eagerly. This supper felt like restaurant food, despite costing very little to make at home, with just 5 basic ingredients that were readily available in every grocery store. White fish, like cod or haddock, was relatively inexpensive during the 1950s, and potatoes were always cheap year-round, making this an affordable meal for tight budgets. The frying technique made simple ingredients taste rich and indulgent, transforming plain fish and potatoes into something special that felt like a treat rather than just dinner. Children loved eating fish and chips with their hands. This proved that frying could transform humble ingredients into something that felt special and exciting, worth looking forward to at the end of a long week. Savory ham custard pie combined diced ham, eggs, and cheese in a quiche-like dish that tasted elegant despite being made with simple, inexpensive ingredients. During 1950s, Grandma lined a pie pan with a store-bought or homemade pie crust. She diced leftover ham into small cubes and scattered them evenly across the bottom of the crust, distributing them so every slice would have meat in it. She shredded cheddar cheese and sprinkled it over the ham generously, creating a flavorful layer that would melt into the custard during baking in the oven. In a bowl, she beat eggs with milk, adding a little salt and pepper for seasoning and flavor. The pie, baked at 375 degrees Fahrenheit for about 35 minutes until the custard was set in the center and the top was lightly golden, developing a slight puff. She let it rest for 5 minutes after removing it from the oven so the custard would firm up and make slicing easier without falling apart, looking restaurant quality and impressive to anyone who saw it. Grandma served it warm for supper with a simple green salad on the side, creating a light but satisfying meal that didn't feel heavy or overly rich. This dish stretched a small amount of leftover ham to feed 6 people when combined with eggs and cheese in a custard, making it extremely economical. The pie format made it feel special and sophisticated. Americans were just beginning to discover quiche during the 1950s, and this was a home-style version that used ingredients everyone had on hand without needing exotic seasonings. A combination of eggs, milk, ham, and cheese provided complete protein and calcium in every slice, making it nutritious as well as delicious. This proved that eggs could be the foundation for elegant suppers, not just breakfast dishes, expanding the possibilities for budget cooking when creativity helped stretch resources further. Southern fried chicken dinner turned inexpensive chicken pieces into crispy golden perfection that tasted restaurant quality, despite costing pennies during 1950s budget cooking when proper techniques elevated simple ingredients into something memorable. Grandma cut a whole chicken into pieces or bought chicken quarters on sale, then soaked them in buttermilk for about 30 minutes to tenderize the meat. She set up a shallow dish with seasoned flour, plenty of salt, black pepper, and sometimes a little paprika for color and visual appeal on the plate. She dredged each chicken piece thoroughly in the flour mixture, coating it completely on all sides so the breading would be even and crispy when fried. She heated about an inch of oil in a large cast-iron skillet until it was hot enough that a pinch of flour sizzled immediately when dropped in carefully. She carefully placed the chicken pieces in the hot oil, skin side down, being careful not to crowd the pan so they would fry properly without steaming. The chicken fried for about 12 minutes per side until it developed a deep golden brown, crispy crust, and the meat was cooked through to the bone completely. She removed the pieces to drain on paper towels, letting the excess oil drip away while the chicken stayed hot and crispy on the outside. Meanwhile, she made quick pan gravy by pouring off most of the oil but leaving the browned bits, adding flour to make a roux, then whisking in milk. This fried chicken supper with creamy gravy was special enough for Sunday dinner, but could be made any day of the week when families wanted something celebratory. The crispy coating and juicy meat made even cheap chicken quarters taste luxurious and special, transforming humble ingredients into something everyone loved eating without complaints. The buttermilk tenderized the meat and added tang to the flavor, creating depth that made the chicken taste more complex and interesting than plain fried chicken. The pan drippings became delicious gravy so nothing went to waste, demonstrating the resourcefulness of Depression-era and 1950s cooks who valued every ingredient. Crumbled beef and potato hash turned ground beef and potatoes into a hearty skillet supper that satisfied hungry families without costing much during 1950s budget weeks, when stretching meat with inexpensive starches was essential. Grandma browned ground beef in a large cast-iron skillet over medium-high heat, breaking it into fine crumbles as it cooked, then drained most of the fat. She added diced potatoes cut into small half-inch cubes so they would cook quickly and develop crispy edges that everyone loved at the dinner table. She added diced onion that would soften and caramelize, adding sweetness and depth to the savory dish that made it more complex and flavorful overall. Everything cooked together, stirring occasionally, for about 15 minutes until the potatoes were tender inside and golden brown and crispy on the edges where they touched the hot pan. She added ketchup and a little water, stirring to create a thick sauce that coated everything and added sweet, tangy flavor that children especially loved. A pat of butter stirred in at the end added richness and made the sauce silkier, coating everything with a glossy sheen that looked appealing. This one-skillet supper was simple but deeply satisfying because of the crispy potatoes, savory beef, and sweet ketchup sauce that balanced perfectly together. The combination of textures, crispy potatoes, tender beef, to soft onions, made every bite interesting and kept people eating until their plates were clean without leftovers. Grandma served it straight from the skillet onto plates, sometimes topping each serving with a fried egg for extra protein if eggs were available that week. This meal used ingredients every household kept on hand and came together quickly on busy weeknights when time was limited and everyone was hungry. The ketchup made it appeal to children who might otherwise refuse plain beef and potatoes, sweetening the dish just enough to make it acceptable to picky eaters. The entire supper cost less than $1 to feed 6 people, making it extremely economical during tight budget weeks when grocery money was scarce. Melted tuna sandwiches transformed canned tuna into hot, gooey, open-faced suppers that tasted rich and indulgent, despite costing almost nothing during 1950s budget cooking when creative preparations kept families interested. Grandma drained 2 cans of tuna and flaked the fish into a bowl with a fork, breaking it into small pieces that would spread easily on bread. She added enough mayonnaise to bind it together and make it spreadable, along with a small diced onion for crunch and flavor that added interest. She mixed everything together thoroughly, adding salt and pepper to taste, and making sure the tuna was well coated with mayonnaise for moisture and richness. She spread the tuna mixture generously on slices of white bread, making sure it reached all the way to the edges so every bite would have filling. She topped each slice with a piece of American cheese or a handful of shredded cheddar, covering the tuna completely so it would melt evenly. The prepared sandwiches went under the broiler for about 3 to 4 minutes until the cheese melted and bubbled and the edges of the bread toasted golden brown. She served them immediately while they were still hot and gooey, with the cheese stretching when people took bites from their plates at the table. These open-faced tuna melts felt like diner food, but cost pennies to make at home with just 5 basic ingredients that every household kept stocked. The hot cheese made simple tuna salad feel more substantial and satisfying, transforming it from a cold lunch food into a proper hot supper for dinner. The toasted bread provided crunch that contrasted nicely with the creamy tuna and melted cheese, creating textural variety that made the sandwiches more interesting to eat. Grandma served these with tomato soup on the side, creating a classic combination that everyone loved and that felt comforting on cold winter nights. These 55 budget suppers show how 1950s grandmas created satisfying meals using only 5 ingredients. From fried fish to tuna melts, each recipe proved that simple ingredients prepared with skill could feed families well for pennies when resourcefulness was essential to household management. Chops with baked legumes paired pork chops with canned beans in a simple one-dish supper that baked together and developed deep, rich flavor during 1950s budget cooking when one-pot meals saved time. Grandma opened 2 large cans of pork and beans and poured them into a baking dish, spreading them evenly across the bottom to create a flavorful base. She stirred in diced onion, a few spoonfuls of brown sugar for sweetness, and a squirt of ketchup for tang and color that made the dish look appealing. She nestled pork chops into the beans, pushing them down so they were partially covered by the bean mixture and would cook in the flavorful liquid. The dish went into a 350 degrees Fahrenheit oven uncovered for about an hour until the pork chops were cooked through and tender and the beans had thickened around the edges. The pork released its juices into the beans as it cooked, flavoring them from the inside out and creating a rich, savory sauce that everyone loved. The beans provided filling bulk that stretched the pork chops to feed more people, making the meal more economical and substantial for large families. The combination of sweet and savory flavors appealed to both adults and children at the table, ensuring everyone ate without complaining or refusing the meal. Grandma made this when she wanted a hands-off supper that would cook while she did other tasks, freeing up her time for other household responsibilities. This proved that pork and beans weren't just for cookouts, but could be a proper supper when prepared correctly with simple techniques and patience. The baking method concentrated flavors and created depth that stovetop cooking couldn't achieve, demonstrating how proper cooking methods elevated simple ingredients into something special. Frank and Biscuit Cobbler turned hot dogs and refrigerated biscuit dough into a fun, filling supper that children loved and mothers appreciated for its creativity during 1950s budget cooking when playful meals helped. Grandma sliced hot dogs into rounds and placed them in a buttered baking dish, distributing them evenly so every serving would have some meat in it. She mixed a can of condensed tomato soup with half a can of water, and poured it over the hot dogs, stirring to coat everything evenly. She added a handful of shredded cheddar cheese, stirring everything together so the cheese would melt into the sauce and add richness and flavor throughout. She opened a tube of refrigerated biscuit dough and tore each biscuit into quarters, then arranged these pieces over the hot dog mixture, covering the surface completely. Some grandmas added a squirt of ketchup and mustard to the hot dog mixture for extra flavor that mimicked the toppings children loved on regular hot dogs. Send the dish baked at 375 degrees Fahrenheit for about 25 minutes until the biscuits were golden brown on top and cooked through, and the hot dog mixture was bubbling around edges. This supper felt playful and different from the usual dinner foods, which children found exciting and fun, making mealtime less of a battle for cooperation. The biscuit topping soaked up the tomato sauce from underneath, becoming rich and flavorful rather than staying dry and plain on top of the casserole. The hot dogs provided protein, the biscuits gave carbohydrates, and the cheese added calcium and richness that made the dish feel more substantial and complete. Grandma made this when she wanted to use up hot dogs in a new way that felt special rather than just serving them plain boiled or fried. The entire dish cost less than $2 to feed 6 people, making it extremely economical during tight weeks when every penny counted toward household expenses. The Cobbler format made humble hot dogs feel more like a proper meal rather than just a quick snack or lunch food that children ate casually. Chicken and breadcrumb bake combined chicken pieces with herb-seasoned stuffing mix in a simple casserole that tasted like Thanksgiving dinner any day of the week during 1950s budget cooking when holiday flavors were desired. Grandma placed chicken pieces in a buttered baking dish and seasoned them with salt and pepper, arranging them so they would cook evenly in the hot oven. She prepared boxed stuffing mix, according to package directions, which usually meant mixing it with hot water or broth and butter until it was moist and flavorful. She spooned the prepared stuffing around and over the chicken pieces, covering them partially so the stuffing would absorb the chicken juices as everything cooked together. She poured a can of cream of chicken soup mixed with half a cup of milk over everything, drizzling it so it reached all the corners. The casserole baked covered at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for about an hour until the chicken was cooked through and tender, absorbing the flavors from the stuffing and soup. She removed the cover for the last 15 minutes to let the stuffing on top get slightly crispy and golden, developing texture and visual appeal. This one-dish supper felt like holiday food, but could be made any weeknight with inexpensive ingredients that didn't require special shopping trips to expensive stores. The stuffing absorbed the chicken juices and cream soup, becoming incredibly flavorful and moist, rather than dry and boring like plain stuffing alone would be. The cream soup created a sauce that kept everything from drying out during the long baking time, ensuring the chicken stayed moist and tender. Grandma made this when she wanted something that felt special, without requiring much effort or expensive ingredients from specialty shops downtown where prices were high. A box of stuffing mix cost very little and made enough to bulk up the chicken substantially, stretching the meal to feed more people. The entire meal came together in one baking dish with minimal preparation required before putting it in the oven to cook unattended. ground meat, and string beans, combined ground beef with canned green beans and potatoes in a hearty one-pot supper that satisfied hungry families during 1950s budget cooking when complete meals in single pot simplified. Grandma browned ground beef in a large pot or Dutch oven over medium-high heat, breaking it into crumbles as it cooked, then drained most of the fat. She added diced potatoes cut into small half-inch cubes and a diced onion, stirring everything together so the flavors would blend as they cooked in the pot. She opened 2 cans of green beans and added them with all their liquid, which would help cook the potatoes and create the sauce for the dish. A can of condensed tomato soup went in next, stirred until everything was well combined and the soup coated all the ingredients evenly without lumps. The pot simmered, covered for about 25 minutes until the potatoes were tender and the flavors had blended together into a cohesive, unified stew. Some grandmas added a little water if the mixture seemed too thick, adjusting the consistency to their family's preferences for soupy or thick stews. This one-pot supper provided protein from beef, vegetables from green beans, and starch from potatoes all together in one easy dish, without needing multiple pots. The tomato soup created a familiar sauce that tied everything together and added moisture that kept the dish from being dry or boring to eat. The green beans became very soft and melded with the other ingredients, creating a unified stew-like consistency that children found easy to eat and swallow. Grandma made this when she needed to stretch ground beef to feed many people on a tight budget, using cheap vegetables to bulk up the meal. The canned green beans cost almost nothing and added bulk and nutrition without requiring fresh vegetables that might not be available or affordable during certain seasons. The potatoes made it filling and substantial, ensuring everyone left the table satisfied and full without needing expensive second helpings of meat. Canned meat, scalloped potatoes, layered Spam with potatoes and cheese in a creamy casserole that tasted rich and indulgent despite costing pennies during 1950s budget cooking when impressive presentations mattered. Grandma sliced potatoes very thin, about 1/8 of an inch thick, using a sharp knife or mandolin for uniform slices that would cook evenly in the oven. She sliced Spam into thin pieces as well, cutting it so it would layer nicely between the potatoes and distribute evenly throughout the casserole dish. In a buttered casserole dish, she layered potatoes, Spam slices, diced onion, and shredded cheese, repeating until the dish was full and ending with cheese on top. She mixed a can of cream of celery soup with a cup of milk and poured it over the layers, making sure it seeped down to the bottom. The casserole baked, covered at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for about an hour, until the potatoes were tender when pierced with a knife, absorbing the creamy sauce and flavors completely. She removed the cover for the last 15 minutes so the cheese on top could brown and bubble, creating an appealing golden crust that looked impressive. This supper felt special and comforting because of the creamy sauce and melted cheese that coated every layer of potatoes and meat throughout the dish. The Spam added salty, smoky flavor throughout without needing expensive ham or bacon that cost more money at the butcher shop downtown. The thin sliced potatoes became tender and absorbed the creamy sauce beautifully, creating a cohesive dish where every ingredient melded together perfectly in harmony. The onion added depth and sweetness that balanced the salty Spam, and the cheese created richness and held everything together in unified layer. Grandma made this when she wanted something that felt like Sunday dinner but couldn't afford expensive ingredients that strained the weekly grocery budget. Spam was cheap, and one can stretch across many servings when layered with potatoes, making it extremely economical for feeding large families with growing children. These 65-ingredient suppers prove that 1950s grandmas were true kitchen geniuses who understood something we've forgotten. Great meals don't require complicated recipes or expensive ingredients. They knew how to turn pantry staples into complete dinners that brought families together around the table every single night, no matter how tight the budget became or how little time they had to cook after long days of work. Every recipe in this collection represents more than just food on a plate. These suppers represent love, resourcefulness, and the determination to feed families well even when money was scarce, and grocery shopping meant counting every penny carefully. Grandmas proved that 5 simple ingredients combined with skill and creativity could create satisfying meals that kept everyone happy, healthy, and gathered together at dinner time when it mattered most. Pick one recipe from this collection and cook it this week for your family. Taste the simplicity and satisfaction our grandmothers knew so well. Share your favorite 5-ingredient supper memory in the comments below. Which recipe did your grandmother make that you still remember today? Your stories keep these traditions alive for the next generation. Comment now, and let's celebrate the genius of 1950s home cooking together.